Hey y'all, Sai here! My son's family asked if we could make them a dining table, similar to the one we have, which we also made. We had some large, thick slabs of juniper, so we ripped one side of each slab to have a flat edge, and then flattened each slab using the flattening jig and the large router. The triangular thing I was holding was catching flying sawdust, and it worked really well. It didn't catch everything, but it did catch a large amount of it. Then we put both slabs up on the table with the flattened sides down. Those ripped sides were not straight at all, but there were spots. The two boards met, so I put some biscuit holes in those areas and I glued in some biscuits. The resin river going in the table would hide this long, gappy joint, so I wasn't too concerned about it. I used some clamps to pull them together and let that glue set up overnight. Then we flattened this side on the jig as much as possible. I wanted the table to be 2 to 3 inches thick. We used some paste wax on the jig, and that allowed the router to slide and trim from one side to the other. Husband set it to trim about 1/8 of an inch each pass. There was one area of the wood that was ditched out, but we left it because if we flattened it down to that level, then the table would have been too thin. So then to sturdy the table, we put some flat bar pieces that will stretch across each slab. I routed out the areas for the bars so they could be flush with the wood, while husband was cutting up the flat bar and getting them ready to attach. He put 16 holes in each of them and drove them in place with 16 screws. Then we flipped the whole thing over and did a little bit more flattening, and it didn't take much since we had already flattened these sides separately. Next was to router out the area for the river. I used my little router and a straight bit for this, and I made it 1/4 of an inch deep, and it took 2 passes. Hey, so it's time to square up the ends of the table, or cut off those extra ends, and the neighbor came over with his track saw, and we cut off one side. I'm like, wait a second, I want to film this! And so we're flipping it around and doing the other side now, and this track saw is awesome! So yay! The track clamps right to the wood, and the saw fits into the tracks and cuts a nice straight line. Husband took a few passes to get through the thickness. Then it was time for sanding. Something I've discovered about these orbital sanders is the little swirl pattern it leaves on the wood. I don't like that about these orbital sanders. Anyway, I'll deal with that later. I also removed the bark from the edges. I used my mallet and a chisel, and it came off nicely. Then I routered out the ends of the river so that the resin would flow and look like it goes through the entire thickness of the table. Then sanded that area and all of the edges of the table. We found some great table legs at a garage sale. They are metal and super heavy. I sanded them lightly and then spray painted them black. Alrighty, so I'm going to be pouring blue resin inside the river, and I have this hole. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill up that hole with some hot glue. That's the plan anyway. So I have it going over here. Hot glue is so messy. It's so messy, but it's so nice. All right. need a lot. So this worked really well, except for where the gap was really wide. So I rolled up some paper to fill the wide gap, just to put something in there, and that worked really well as something for the glue to sit on top of and fill the space. Hey, I want to put a verse right here, so I'm going to go grab my laser. I really like that I can set the laser directly onto the piece I want to laser onto. Right there. Okay, good. Now we'll go to... I just have to adjust the height, and I do that for everything anyway. And I want this down to there. Okay. Focused. I put the verse Luke 14:34. It is Jesus, and he says, "Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored?" And he goes on to say that it can't be restored, but has no use and has to be thrown out. I'm thinking what he's saying here is his point is to be like good salt, which would be useful, and not like worthless salt that isn't good for anything, not even manure. And that's what he said, not even good for manure. Wow. Anyway, salt. Yeah, be salty salt. Then husband attached one leg in the center of the table. We thought maybe that would be all it needed. It looked good, but the table wasn't very sturdy. So he moved that leg and added another, but he did that while I wasn't filming, so I missed it. But here I am working on it, and there are 2 legs. I am wiping mineral spirits on because it will show where those funny spiral marks are, or any other areas that need to have more sanding. And I circled all of those spots with a pencil. Then I went over all of the areas I circled with 220 sandpaper, and it took a bit of work, but it came out nice and unswirly. I used Gorilla duct tape on the ends to act as a barrier for resin, which works pretty well. Then I used my resin calculator app and calculated how much resin I would need to mix up for the river. And for some reason, something I did wrong, I'm sure, it didn't calculate right, and I ended up not having enough resin. So I ended up having to mix more. Oh well. And the resin did find little tunnels to leak through, so I went around taping those areas. All right, I'm excited to take the stuff off. The stuff off and see how the edges look. Well, I guess I could take this one off first. And this stuff was pretty sticky and difficult to take off. One side was really bowed, so I cut it with the jigsaw, then shaped and sanded it with the orbital, and did that on both ends of the table. I will be putting a final clear coat of resin over everything, so the swirls from the orbital on the resin will be covered with new resin and won't be noticeable at all. It isn't like wood and shows everything. Then the little knots and areas I wanted to have blue in them didn't look as blue as I had hoped, so I mixed up more blue and put it in those areas. And I had so much extra mixed up this time, I just spread it over the entire table, which gave it a slightly blue hue, which I wasn't sure if I liked it or not, but in the end it looked okay. When that resin was all set up, then I sanded over it to give it a grip for the final coat of clear. And like I said before, the new resin will fill in and hide any scratches on the resin it is adhering to. It's great stuff. I sanded, blew off the dust, wiped it with mineral spirits, then blew it again to dry it, and then mixed up some clear resin. I poured it all over and spread it all around. On the one side, I used a brush to apply the resin since it is a funny concave area where a bunch of branches came out that I had trimmed and sanded. It is hidden, but when you squat down to look at it, I think it looks cool. Then I used the torch on it to remove any surface bubbles, and I did this every 15 minutes for about 45 minutes. Oh, and I did this when I poured the blue too. Then husband added a few more bolts to the legs. I didn't realize he had run out of bolts earlier and hadn't finished putting them in. When that was all set up, I sanded off the drip nubbins of the resin. Yay! Then I cleaned the legs because they were covered in resin dust. Well, the table's all done, and I love it! Yay! I'm excited about it! Yay! So, TotalBoat right now has 15% coupon if you use size corner, if you go to TotalBoat and buy stuff. So you can check that out, and that's good until December 31st, 2021. And, anywho, yeah, love it. So I guess we'll see you next time. Bye!